The cable was singing. That's what the old-timers called it. When a steel line stretched beyond its limit, it made a sound, a high-pitched whine that cut through the roar of the steam engine and the crash of falling timber. If you heard the singing, you had maybe 2 seconds, maybe less. On a November morning in 1903, in a camp outside Aberdeen, Washington, a choker setter named William Paulson heard that sound. He was 23 years old. He'd been married for 6 weeks. The foreman would later tell the coroner that Paulson turned toward the sound. That was the wrong thing to do. The cable snapped at 4,000 pounds of tension, whipped across the landing at roughly 200 miles per hour, and cut William Paulson nearly in half at the waist. The steam donkey kept running. Nobody had time to shut it down. The boiler was still pressurized, the drum still turning, the next log already being dragged up the hillside. They wrapped what was left of William Paulson in canvas, loaded him onto a rail car, and sent him down to town. The crew was back at work within the hour. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday. Between 1890 and 1930, the steam donkey killed more Pacific Northwest loggers than falling trees, rolling logs, and forest fires combined. At the industry's peak, 1 logger died every single week in Washington state alone. Not from chainsaws, not from heights, from the machine that was supposed to make their jobs easier. And here's what makes this story worth telling. The steam donkey didn't malfunction. It didn't break down. It worked exactly as designed. The deaths were built into the engineering. They were the cost of doing business. And for 40 years, the lumber industry decided that cost was acceptable. This is the story of the most dangerous machine in American industrial history. A machine so lethal, it had its own graveyards. A machine that built the cities of the West Coast on a foundation of broken bodies and widowed families. And a machine that most people today have never heard of. You're about to hear every cable snap, every boiler explosion, every man who never came home. Because someone should remember what it cost to build the world we inherited. Let's go back to where it started. The year is 1881. The place is Eureka, California. And a man named John Dolbear is standing in the redwood forest, watching a team of oxen fail. You have to understand what logging looked like before the steam donkey to understand why anyone would invent something so dangerous. In the 1870s, getting a felled tree from the forest to the mill was a nightmare of physics and animal labor. You'd cut down a redwood or a Douglas fir. These trees weighed anywhere from 10 to 50 tons. Then you had to move them, sometimes for miles, through terrain that had no roads, no rails, nothing but mud and stumps and more trees. The solution was oxen. Teams of 8, 12, sometimes 16 animals yoked together, dragging logs along grease-skid roads. The work was brutally slow. A good team might move 3 or 4 logs in a day. The animals died constantly from exhaustion, injury, and disease. The men who drove them died too, crushed when a log shifted, trampled when the oxen spooked, and worked to death in conditions that would be criminal today. John Dolbear watched this and saw a problem that steam power could solve. Dolbear wasn't a logger. He was a machinist and inventor who owned a sawmill in Eureka. He understood steam engines. He'd seen what they could do in factories and on railroads. And he had a simple idea. What if you could anchor a steam engine to the ground, wrap a cable around a drum, and use that cable to drag logs instead of animals? The first Dolbear donkey was almost laughably crude. A single-cylinder vertical steam engine mounted on a wooden sled, connected to a wooden spool. The whole thing weighed about 4 tons and produced maybe 12 horsepower. Dolbear tested it in August of 1881, and it worked. Sort of. The cable kept slipping off the spool. The engine overheated. The anchor system failed, and the whole machine dragged itself toward the log instead of the other way around. But even that first prototype could do something oxen couldn't. It could pull continuously. It didn't get tired. It didn't need to rest, and it didn't care how steep the hillside was. Dolbear patented his invention in 1882. Within 2 years, every major logging operation in Northern California had at least one. Within a decade, the steam donkey had spread up the coast to Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. The timber industry would never be the same, but neither would the men who worked around these machines. The problem was simple. John Dolbear had invented a way to generate enormous mechanical force in the middle of the wilderness. He had not invented a way to control it safely. The early steam donkeys used manila rope, the same material sailors used for rigging ships. Manila was strong, flexible, and relatively inexpensive. It was also completely wrong for the job. Under the constant stress of dragging multi-ton logs over rough terrain, manila rope frayed, stretched, and snapped without warning. When it broke, the stored tension released all at once. The rope became a whip. In 1886, a crew in Humboldt County lost 3 men in a single week to rope failures. The company's response was not to stop using rope, it was to switch to wire cable. This solved one problem and created a dozen others. Steel cable was stronger than manila. It could handle heavier loads over longer distances. But steel cable was also heavier, stiffer, and far more dangerous when it failed. A snapped manila rope might leave a welt or break a bone. A snapped steel cable could decapitate a man standing 50 feet away. The industry learned this quickly. They learned it through funerals. By 1890, the basic design of the steam donkey had evolved into something far more powerful than Dolbear's original prototype. The machines now weighed 15 to 20 tons. They had multiple drums for different cables. They could produce 50, 60, even 100 horsepower, and they could pull logs weighing 20 tons up hillsides so steep that a man couldn't walk up them without grabbing tree roots for handholds. The logging camps called this progress. They called it efficiency. They called it the future of the industry. They were right about all of that, but they weren't telling the whole truth. Let me explain exactly what a steam donkey did, because the power of this machine is hard to comprehend unless you've seen the terrain it worked in. The Pacific Northwest is not flat. The trees that built Seattle and Portland and San Francisco grew on mountainsides that rise thousands of feet from sea level. They grew in valleys so steep that sunlight only reached the floor for a few hours each day. They grew in places where no road could go, no railroad could reach, no oxen could survive. The steam donkey made it possible to log these places anyway. Here's how it worked. You'd set up the donkey at a central location called a landing. This was usually on a ridge or a relatively flat spot where logs could be collected and loaded onto rail cars or flumes. From the landing, you'd run cables out into the surrounding forest, and sometimes for a quarter mile or more. The cables were strung through blocks attached to stumps or standing trees called spar trees. When the crew felled a tree, they'd cut it into manageable lengths and wrap a short cable called a choker around each log. The choker attached to the main line. Then the donkey operator, called a donkey puncher, would engage the drum and start pulling. The log would drag across the ground, over stumps, through brush, up the hillside toward the landing. This sounds simple. It was anything but. A typical operation might have 2,000 feet of main line out, weighing several tons by itself. Add a log weighing 15 tons. Add the friction of dragging that log over rough ground. The steam donkey's boiler would be running at full pressure, 150 to 200 pounds per square inch. When the drum would be turning against a brake that could slip at any moment. The cable would be stretched to its rated capacity and sometimes beyond. Everything in the system was under tension. Everything was waiting to fail. And surrounding this web of taut steel cables were men, choker setters scrambling over fallen timber to attach the next log, rigging slingers climbing spar trees to adjust blocks and guide lines, whistle punks signaling the donkey puncher when to start and stop, landing men unhooking logs and stacking them for transport. Each of these jobs put you directly in the path of a cable that could snap at any moment. Each of these jobs required you to trust your life to equipment that was often poorly maintained, overloaded, and pushed past its design limits. The industry knew this. The accident reports make it clear. They kept building the machines more powerful anyway. By 1900, the steam donkey had transformed from Dolbear's crude prototype into an industrial monster. The largest models weighed over 30 tons. They could pull logs weighing 25 tons up slopes of 60 degrees or more. They could yard timber from distances of 3,000 feet. They burned cord after cord of wood to keep their boilers pressurized, their drums turning, their cables humming with lethal potential. And they were everywhere. A major logging operation might have a dozen steam donkeys working simultaneously, their cables crisscrossing the hillside in a pattern that old-timers called a spider's web. Each cable was a potential killer. Each intersection was a potential disaster. Walk with me through a typical day at a steam donkey operation around 1905. Feel what these men felt, understand what they risked every hour they worked. You wake up at 4 in the morning in a bunkhouse that smells like sweat, tobacco, and damp wool. The bunks are stacked 3 high, and the man above you coughed blood all night. Tuberculosis runs through these camps like gossip. You eat a breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Then you walk out into darkness and cold and fog. The steam donkey is already running. You can hear it before you see it. The chuff, chuff, chuff of the engine, the clank of the cable drums, the screech of metal on metal. The boiler has been building pressure since 3 a.m. The donkey puncher has been there since before dawn, feeding wood into the firebox, watching the pressure gauge, testing the cables. Your job today is choker setting, meaning you're 20 years old. You make $3 a day, and for the next 12 hours, you're going to be directly under cables that can snap without warning and kill you before you hear the sound. The first log goes without incident. You scramble down the hillside, wrap the choker around a 16-foot section of Douglas fir, signal the whistle punk, and dive behind a stump as the cable goes taut. The log lurches, drags, crashes through underbrush, and disappears up the slope toward the landing. The cable goes slack. You move to the next one. This is the rhythm. Wrap, signal, hide, repeat, hour after hour. The danger becomes background noise. You stop flinching every time a cable whines. You stop diving for cover every time you hear metal scrape. You get comfortable. That's when men die. Around 10 in the morning, someone miscalculates. A log snags on a stump. The donkey puncher doesn't see it and keeps pulling. The cable stretches and stretches and stretches. The singing starts. If you're lucky, you recognize the sound. You're close to a stump or a depression where you can throw yourself flat. The cable snaps, whips across the hillside, and misses you by inches. You lie there shaking, covered in dirt and bark, listening to the echo fade. Then you get up and go back to work. If you're not lucky, you don't hear it in time. Or you're in the open with nowhere to hide. Or the cable doesn't whip sideways but recoils straight back toward the donkey, and you're standing in that path. The death certificates from this era are clinical: laceration of abdomen, crushing injury to skull, traumatic amputation of lower extremities. They don't describe the screaming. They don't describe the way the body looks afterward. They don't describe the crew standing around with nowhere to look, nothing to say, knowing it could have been them, knowing it might be them tomorrow. The cables weren't the only killers. The boilers were just as dangerous. A steam donkey's boiler operated at pressures that would be considered insane by modern standards. 150 pounds per square inch was common. Some ran higher. The boilers were built from riveted steel plates, and they were maintained by men who often had no formal training. They were operated in conditions of extreme heat, extreme cold, constant vibration, and corrosive smoke. Boiler explosions happened with terrifying regularity. When a boiler failed, it released all of its stored energy at once. The explosion could throw pieces of metal hundreds of feet. It could scald everyone within range with superheated steam. It could start fires that raced through the slash and debris of the logging operation and turn the entire mountainside into an inferno. In July 1907, a boiler exploded at a camp near Hoquiam, Washington. The donkey puncher, a man named Charles Lindgren, was killed instantly. So was the fireman, whose name was never recorded in the newspapers. The blast started a fire that burned for 3 days and destroyed 200 acres of timber that had been marked for harvest. The company's official position was that Lindgren had let the water level in the boiler drop too low. This may have been true, but Lindgren had been working 18-hour shifts for 2 weeks straight. He'd requested relief and been denied. He was exhausted. He made a mistake, and the machine killed him for it. The company paid his widow $75. This was the fundamental bargain of the steam donkey era. The company got the most powerful logging tool ever invented. The workers got wages that were better than farming. but came with a statistical likelihood of death or maiming that would be unacceptable in any other industry. The companies understood this bargain perfectly. They factored it into their operating costs. Most logging companies in this era carried no workers' compensation insurance. When a man was killed, the family might receive a small payment. $50 was typical, $100 if the company was feeling generous. This was supposed to cover funeral expenses and tide the widow over until she could find other means of support. In return, the family was expected to sign a release waiving any right to sue. Most signed. What choice did they have? The accident records from the Washington State Bureau of Labor Statistics tell the story in numbers. In 1906, the logging industry reported 412 serious injuries and 89 deaths. The actual numbers were almost certainly higher, as many camps didn't bother reporting accidents to the state. In 1907, the numbers were worse. 523 injuries, 104 deaths. In 1908, even worse, 618 injuries, 97 deaths. The steam donkey wasn't the only cause of these casualties, but it was the leading cause. The cables, the boilers, the flying debris when a log broke free. The machine was a nexus of lethal possibilities, and the men who worked around it understood this with a clarity that we, from the safety of our century, can barely imagine. But they kept working anyway. They had families to feed. Let me tell you about some of the men who didn't come home. Andrew Nilsson was a Swedish immigrant who worked as a rigging slinger near Centralia, Washington. He was 41 years old, with a wife and 4 children back in Tacoma. His job was to climb the spar trees at the center of each cable network and adjust the blocks that guided the main lines. It was considered one of the most dangerous jobs in logging, which is saying something. On March 3, 1909, Nilsson was 120 feet up a spar tree when a cable slipped from its block. The cable didn't snap, it simply slid free, dropping its tension all at once. The sudden shift threw Nilsson from his perch. He fell for 2 seconds, hit the ground beside the tree, and died on impact. His son Eric was 15. He'd been planning to join his father in the woods that summer, to learn the trade, to start earning. Instead, he went to work in a sawmill, which was considered safer. He lost 3 fingers to a blade in 1912. Thomas Barker was a donkey puncher from Maine who'd come west in 1895, chasing the promise of higher wages. He worked 20 years without serious injury, which was remarkable. Other men called him lucky. In February 1915, at a camp on the Olympic Peninsula, his luck ended. The boiler he was operating had been patched twice in the previous year. The company had been warned by a state inspector that the patches were inadequate. The company ignored the warning. Replacement boilers were expensive. On February 18th, the weakened seam split open. The steam release was nearly instantaneous. Thomas Barker was cooked alive at his station. The coroner's report noted that he'd tried to crawl away from the machine. He'd made it about 8 feet. The company paid his widow $75. James Wong was Chinese-American, born in San Francisco, working in the woods because anti-Chinese laws made most other employment impossible. The Chinese workers were given the worst jobs, the lowest pay, and the most dangerous positions. They were often assigned as choker setters on the steepest slopes, where the risk of cable failure was highest. On November 12, 1911, James Wong was setting chokers on a hillside above Astoria, Oregon. A log broke free from its choker and began rolling down the slope. Wong tried to run. He wasn't fast enough. The log caught him against a stump and crushed his pelvis. He was still alive when the crew reached him. He was still alive 2 hours later when they got him to a wagon. He died before reaching town. His name appears in the accident report only as J. Wong, Chinese. No age recorded, no address, no next of kin. These were not rare events. This was the normal pace of death in the logging industry. 1 man per week in Washington state alone, more in Oregon, more in California, more in British Columbia. The steam donkey was the center of an industry that consumed human lives with the same efficiency it consumed timber, and nobody stopped it. The state legislatures passed safety regulations. The logging companies ignored them. The inspectors issued citations. The companies paid fines that amounted to a fraction of a day's profits. The newspapers printed the death notices. The public read them and turned the page. The loggers themselves developed their own coping mechanisms. They told dark jokes about death. They developed superstitions about which machines were unlucky. They drank heavily on their days off, which were rare. Some found religion, others found fatalism. One retired logger, interviewed in the 1950s by a labor historian, put it this way: "We all knew we were going to die. The only question was whether it would be fast or slow. The cable was fast. The saw was slow. The whiskey was slowest of all." The steam donkey era didn't end because the industry suddenly developed a conscience. It ended because technology moved on. The first gasoline-powered yarders appeared around 1910. They were lighter, cheaper, and didn't require the massive amounts of wood needed to fuel a steam boiler. More importantly, they could be mounted on tractors and move more easily from site to site. By the 1920s, the internal combustion engine had largely replaced steam in logging operations. The new machines were still dangerous. Cables still snapped. Men still died. But the worst excesses of the steam era were over. The boiler explosions stopped. The massive stationary engines gave way to mobile equipment that at least offered workers the possibility of getting out of the way. The last commercial steam donkey operations in the Pacific Northwest shut down in the late 1940s. By then, chainsaws and diesel yarders had made them obsolete. The machines themselves were abandoned in the forests where they'd worked, left to rust in the second-growth timber that eventually covered the stumps of the old growth they'd helped harvest. And some of those machines are still out there. If you hike in the right parts of the Olympic Peninsula or the Oregon Coast Range, you can find them. Massive iron boilers half buried in ferns and moss. Cable drums frozen with rust. Smokestacks leaning at angles, filled with bird nests and spider webs. They look peaceful now, almost innocent. The forest has reclaimed them, softened their edges, hidden the violence they once represented. But if you look closely, you can still see the scars they left. The old skid roads, visible as linear depressions in the undergrowth, where thousands of logs were dragged to their deaths. The stumps of the spar trees, cut high to allow cables to run clear, still showing the notches where climbing irons bit into the wood. The strange rectangles of different vegetation marking the old landing sites, where the soil was compacted and burned and nothing grew properly for decades afterward. And if you knew where to look, you could find the graves. Most logging camps had their own cemeteries. They were small, unofficial, usually just a cleared patch of ground on a hillside with wooden markers that rotted away within a generation. The bodies buried there were the men who couldn't be transported to town, or whose families couldn't afford proper burial, or who had no family at all. These graveyards are mostly lost now. The forests grew back, the wooden crosses fell, the names disappeared, but the men were real. They lived and worked and died so that lumber could become houses, so that cities could rise, so that America could build itself from coast to coast. They were the price of progress, a price that was paid in flesh and bone and blood, a price that was considered acceptable by an industry and a society that valued timber more than human life. What do we owe them? I've been thinking about that question for a long time. What do we owe the men who died running the machines that built our world? What do we owe the widows who raised children alone? What do we owe the communities that sent their young men into the woods and got back corpses? We owe them, at minimum, memory. We owe them the acknowledgement that they existed, that they mattered, that their deaths were not just statistics in a bureau report, but tragedies that rippled through families and communities for generations. We owe them the understanding that the houses we live in, the cities we inhabit, the very ground we walk on, came at a cost that was not evenly distributed. The investors got rich, the consumers got cheap lumber, the workers got death. We owe them the refusal to romanticize their era. The steam donkey wasn't a noble tool wielded by rugged individualists. It was a killing machine operated by desperate men who had no other options, in an industry that treated them as expendable, in a country that looked the other way. And maybe we owe them this: the commitment to never build like that again, to never accept an industry that kills one worker per week as the cost of doing business, to never allow profit to justify predictable, preventable death. The steam donkey is gone now. The men who operated it are gone. The forests they cleared have mostly grown back. But the choice they represent, the choice between human life and economic efficiency, is still with us. It shows up in every workplace safety regulation, every workers' compensation claim, every argument about the cost of doing business. The steam donkey killed one logger every week for 40 years. Somebody decided that was acceptable. Somebody decided that the lumber was worth the blood. We get to decide differently. That's the inheritance of all those deaths. Not just the wood that built our houses, but the knowledge of what happens when we don't. The cables have stopped singing, but we should never stop listening.